Hi, I'm Tom Davidoff, and I want to talk about housing affordability in Vancouver. I'm going to present some really simplistic analysis of the Vancouver housing market, so you might find some of what I say objectionable just because I'm oversimplifying. I'm going to assume a square foot of housing is a square foot of housing, whether it's in North Vancouver or the west side of Vancouver or Burnaby. I'm going to assume a square foot of housing is a square foot of housing, whether it's rented or owned, and whether it's in a luxury mansion or in a tiny apartment. So if you think anything I've assumed is messing up my results, or you just want to chat about what I've done, please reach out to me. I'm at thomas.davidoff@sauder.ubc.ca, where I'm an associate professor in the Strategy and Business Economics group and where I teach real estate. Or you can reach me on Twitter at tomdavidoff. Okay, so Vancouver today certainly has an affordability problem, and it's got people very worked up, rightly so, I think. But Vancouver's always going to have a problem with affordability. Why? Some markets, like the sort of Winnipegs or Dallas or Des Moines of the world, housing prices look a lot like the number of square feet times how much it costs to build. So if it costs $200 a square foot to build in Vancouver, you're not going to see a 1,000 square foot home for $200,000, but you might see something like that in a lot of markets in the States and probably some markets in Canada. What kind of market would that be? That would be a market where you can build as many square feet as you want without limitation. In Vancouver, there's lots of limitations, so price is bigger than construction cost. And some barriers that we have are physical barriers, mountains and oceans, and regulations. So if the vertical axis is price per square foot of housing, and the horizontal axis is how many housing units we have fewer housing units at a higher price than we'd have without regulations or barriers like mountains and oceans or regulations. So, Vancouver's always going to be more expensive to live in than a lot of other places, but there's things policies can do to make things better. Now, recently, we've faced an important challenge, which is if this downward sloping line is people's willingness to pay to live in Vancouver. So at the very top, you'd have someone very affluent who lives in a 1,000 square foot home. If that was the only guy in Vancouver and he was paying $2,000 a square foot to live here, and construction costs were only $200, more housing would get built. He'd buy a bigger house. Somebody a little less affluent would buy a property willing to pay less than the most affluent guy, etc. So we reach an equilibrium where the available amount of housing, given regulations, natural barriers, and construction costs, is such that the willingness to pay of the last guy who's willing to buy a house is the current market price. Now that price has jumped. Why? Because a lot of people recently seem to have an interest in Vancouver as a sort of pied-à-terre. People who don't live and work in Vancouver and may not even use the housing as rental housing, but just want to buy it as a sort of speculative investment. We sense that this demand must be coming from overseas because over the last year, the macroeconomy hasn't gotten much more favorable for housing, but the loonie's fallen by about 40% relative to the dollar and the yuan, and housing prices in the most desirable neighborhoods have risen by about that same 40%. So it sure looks like overseas demand for housing, not as a place to live and work or even house a worker, but more as a speculative asset, has really grown. And so prices have grown. And now when you see a property being bought, it's commonly not people who live and work in Vancouver buying the property, but rather, in many cases, especially at the higher end, people who don't intend to use the house to live and work in Vancouver or to use the property as a rental either. And that means there's fewer people who can afford to live and work in Vancouver. And so an affordability problem that would exist without outside demand is probably more severe than it would be otherwise if we didn't have this sort of pied-à-terre demand for lightly used properties. Okay, why is pied-à-terre properties, that is vacant or just used literally as a pied-à-terre for the occasional visit, why is there demand for that kind of property in and around Vancouver? And I should say, We don't know how large the extent of this demand is, but we think it's there given recent price movements, and I'll talk about a way that we can measure it very efficiently. Okay, so what drives this overseas pied-à-terre demand? Well, suppose you're a rich guy in a country that lacks environmental amenity, where your property isn't safe from confiscation by the state, and there's a lot of political instability that puts your money at risk. You'd like to be somewhere beautiful, institutionally, legally, physically safe, and with a stable government. Vancouver satisfies all of those. Nice place to occasionally visit the property where you're parking cash. Now, you also want to get a decent return on the money you invest in housing. And how can you get a decent return on housing if you're basically blowing off the dividend component of housing? After all, when you invest in a house, your financial return on your investment consists of the growth in price, which of course can be negative. Owning a home is risky and prices can rise or fall. But if you think prices are going to rise, you're going to pay more, all else equal, for a piece of property because next year your money will have increased in value. So places where people expect price growth are more expensive. And because Vancouver has regulatory and physical barriers to growth, as demand grows over time, the price per unit of square foot, be it a rental or an owner unit, is likely to rise. So you're likely to get good capital gains or price growth on your investment, and that means with mobile capital, you don't need as big of a rental dividend. And sure enough, for higher end properties in Vancouver at the townhome level, you're looking at 2.5% ratios of rent to price, even after you subtract off property taxes, maybe 2.5, 3 before property taxes. And in luxury homes, you're looking at 1%, maybe 1.3 before property taxes, 1% afterwards. Very low rental dividend. In lots of cities, you'd see 4 or 5%. So Vancouver has very low ratios of rent to price. Why? 2 reasons. First of all, what I mentioned, the good growth potential. If you think capital is mobile, then markets with more growth potential are going to have lower rental dividends as a fraction of price. The other point is, if you have higher property taxes, you need to be compensated with more rent to be willing to invest in a market. Okay? Vancouver has very low bargain basement property taxes. And that means you don't need much of a rental dividend. High growth potential, low property taxes, low rental dividend. That means if I hold a property purely for speculation on price growth and don't care about the dividend, because I'm just going to occasionally use the property as a pied-à-terre, Vancouver is the market for me. Our ultra-low property tax plus growth potential allows investors to neglect the rental dividend. And so, when we've had an expansion of pied-à-terre, get my capital out of its current country, plausibly China in many cases, over the last year we've seen an expansion of this demand, and Vancouver's a natural target, especially with the weak loonie, and so we've seen a tremendous amount of price growth. And as the number of housing units used by the workforce shrinks, we're also seeing an increase in rent per square foot. And so we've really almost got an affordability crisis. And what do we mean by an affordability problem? People who are willing to pay the current price and live and work here are really struggling. And lots of people who would live here without the price increase are giving up and moving out. That's the affordability problem. And that's what we address with the BC Housing Affordability Program, Affordability Fund rather. That is a program that I, along with colleagues, have developed here at UBC, and we've got 50 of the top economists in British Columbia at UBC and at Simon Fraser who all agree that the BC Housing Affordability Fund is a great way to address affordability without destroying property values, without asking anybody to compromise on amenity. Okay, here's the idea. We've got this demand for pied-à-terres, and we're going to say everybody in British Columbia needs to either, or not in British Columbia, rather participating jurisdictions, so that would be Vancouver, Lower Mainland areas. This policy is not appropriate, in my opinion, for a place like Whistler. We'll leave that aside for the moment. But for jurisdictions that opt in, okay, if you're a pied-à-terre owner, you have to pay an extra 1.5% property tax. Okay, so we're currently at a very low level of 0.4%. You add another 1.5%, you're getting to 2%, which would be a moderately high level of property taxes for most markets in North America, and probably where BC should be at altogether. But politically, we're not going to shift the income tax down, sales tax down, and property tax up. So we're just going to get to close to 2% if you are someone who is not paying Canadian income taxes and isn't using the property to be a landlord for a tenant who lives and works in BC. So you got to pay an extra property tax. And that property tax revenue can go to write checks to people struggling with affordability. You make Vancouver a more attractive place to live and work because you take revenue from the pied-à-terre overseas demand not contributing to the local economy, and you write checks for people who live and work in British Columbia. That makes affordability better, and in some ways that pushes up demand for housing. Okay, so that's the good news. We make it more attractive to live and work in Vancouver. That's part of the good news by writing checks. The other thing we do that's good is suppose you own a pied-à-terre, you barely use it, and all of a sudden you've got to pay an extra 1.5% in property taxes. And you realize that under the BC Housing Affordability Fund, if you live and work in Vancouver, if you're on the Canadian pension plan, if you've owned your property for a long time, or you pay high Canadian income taxes, or declare rental income to the Canada Revenue Agency, then you're off the hook. So if I've got a vacant place, all I have to do is convert it to a rental, and I no longer owe the tax. That's less revenue to write checks to people who live and work in Vancouver, but rental housing is just as good as owner housing in terms of affordability. P2, the price after we impose the BC Housing Affordability Fund, we add units to the rental housing stock. That lowers the rental cost of owning a house. Doesn't necessarily lower prices, but in terms of affordability, decent rentals are an okay step. So we can get housing units currently vacant. We'll move from quantity 2, with very few units available for people who live and work here, to quantity 1, because some of the pied-à-terre owners are going to decide to rent out their properties to get away from the tax. We'll still get some revenue, but some of the potential revenue will just go to housing affordability by turning vacant units to rental units. More affordability plus checks on the units that are still occupied as pied-à-terres, essentially vacant, and those checks go to people who live and work in Vancouver and struggle with affordability. Now, some people are going to run away from the tax. They're going to say, you know what? I don't want the nuisance of being a landlord. I don't want to pay a 1.5% tax. That could push prices down a little bit further because you're going to have current pied-à-terre investors walk away. Christy Clark has asked that we not think about policies that lower prices in and around British Columbia because we want to protect people who've bought homes. Well, the good news in our plan is that if you live and work in British Columbia, you're getting a check now. That's going to make more demand, more willingness to pay for homes here among people who live and work here, and that should offset a lot of the decrease from getting rid of some pied-à-terre investors. And a lot of pied-à-terre investors are just going to write checks to people who live and work here or convert their units to rentals. So the summary of the British Columbia Housing Affordability Fund: all taxpayers who live and work in British Columbia get money. We provide incentives to turn what we might call bag of cash homes that are currently unoccupied. Those homes, some of them are going to be converted to rental to run away from this tax because landlords get a tax credit against the contribution. They don't have to pay a 1.5% property tax if they declare rental income on their property to the Canada Revenue Agency. More rental housing, more affordability. Bags of cash get sent to BC workforce, more affordability. There's some disincentive to outside investment, so prices fall, but Vancouver becomes a better place to live and work, so prices rise. Another benefit of the BC Housing Affordability Fund: to avoid the 1.5% property tax on pied-à-terre owners, you have to tell the government, I'm a CPP recipient, I have lived here and this is my tax address for enough years in the past, or here's how much money I paid in tax to CRA last year, and every dollar of that tax is a credit against the BC Housing Affordability Fund contribution. Every dollar of gross rental income reported to CRA is a deduction. When people report why they are or are not required to pay into the BC Housing Affordability Fund, the government learns how many people are using homes as essentially nearly empty pied-à-terres. The government has proposed instead to spend money to do a study that'll give a not great answer because the data is not generally available, okay? With the BC Housing Affordability Fund, people who live and work here get a check, and all we ask them to do is tick a box in return to make sure they don't have to pay into the fund. Pied-à-terre owners write a check, and we can count how many checks we get. That gives us the information to learn. Is this a big problem? Are many, many houses being used up as pied-à-terres? Or are we making this up, and in fact, everybody who has bought a house recently is living and working here, in which case there's not much to be done. We get the answer, and taxpayers get paid instead of paying for a study while we wait and do nothing as the affordability problem mushrooms. Okay, so another benefit of BCHAF, in not only do taxpayers get money, not only do we turn vacant homes into rentals, but we also get information. How big is the problem? And instead of paying for the study, we get money for taxpayers as a result of learning the extent of the opportunity, and we don't have to pay to do the study. So great idea. Okay, some other ideas have been floated recently, and I think they're either bad or inefficient. First idea I think is a bad one, is lower impact fees. So if you build a home in BC, you typically have to pay the government for some impact fees, right? Every time you build a new housing unit, you're putting a bit of a burden on infrastructure. Government's asked for an impact fee. In Vancouver, there's also CACs. If you get your property upzoned, the government says, hey, we just increased the value of your property. You've got to kick back some of the money to us, okay? And in the throne speech, the government suggested, you know what we ought to do to increase affordability is lower those impact fees. And we ought to require something like those tobacco warning boxes that says, hey, these impact fees are driving up housing prices. Really not a great idea for a variety of reasons. The problem with affordability is when we've got an almost fixed housing supply, sure, builders respond to incentives, but with very tight regulations, the supply of housing in British Columbia and the Lower Mainland is almost fixed. That means the price is determined by the intersection of quantity with willingness to pay. The price of a house currently is much greater than the construction cost of about $200 a square foot. And in most cases, the price is way bigger even than $200 plus the impact fee. That means you can raise the impact fee and have no impact on the price the consumer pays for a house. Now, when you're thinking of converting an existing house to greater density, the impact fee may be a bit of a disincentive. But the bigger issue is you have developers who would love to pay the existing impact fees if only the jurisdiction, typically Vancouver, would allow them greater density on a site to build more units at a price way above construction plus impact fees. So if I was Premier, I would say, tell you what, Vancouver, we want to give you a bigger incentive to relax zoning. We want you to relax zoning. So you increase your fees, but you're only allowed to impact your fees if you increase your impact fees, if you double or triple the amount of construction. And the government of Vancouver, Vision Vancouver, absolutely has the ability to double or triple construction every year by relaxing zoning regulations. The reason they don't is the fear of local homeowners who don't want to see density in their neighborhood. Homeowners benefit, right? The difference between price and the cost of construction, really economically, it doesn't go into the purchase price of the house, but it does go to the price developers will pay for the land, because the difference between purchase price per square foot and construction plus impact fees, that's profits. Builders are going to bid those profits away, and it's the owner of the land who gets the difference between price and impact fee plus construction cost. Okay? So developers want that badly as long as there's any profit. The municipality could increase density by issuing more permits at a higher price. That higher price would provide revenue that could be used to fund affordability. Now, making it an even worse idea to reduce impact fees, when politicians think, should I relax zoning? They say, well, the good news is I get this impact fee and I can fund my political projects. If the province now tells the local jurisdictions you have to charge a lower impact fee so that builders get bigger profits, that reduces the incentive for municipalities to upzone, because now they still get angry neighbors, but they don't get the impact fees to fund their projects. So we're likely then to see, if you reduce impact fees, you might see jurisdictions clamp down and have more restrictive zoning, which would lead to less construction and higher prices. So you have to be very careful. I think this is a bad idea, not even in a ballpark with the BC Housing Affordability Fund as a way to encourage affordability in Vancouver. Okay, something the mayor of Vancouver is pleased with, which I think is not a good idea, are what I would call $1 million lotteries. And the idea is that the best way to increase housing affordability is to hold lotteries. I think that's inefficient. What do I mean by a lottery? The proposal is, let's take some of the very best land in Vancouver, which could easily sell apartments at $1,000 a square foot, $200 a square foot to build for the government, which doesn't have to pay itself an impact fee. So on a 1,000 square foot apartment, it could sell for $1 million, of which $800,000 is profit. How are you going to allocate that $1 million? Well, one thing to do would be, for each apartment, you sell it at the market, the city makes the profit of $800,000, and they have $800,000 to create housing affordability with. So let's take everybody who's sort of maybe leaving Vancouver today because they don't want to pay the price per square foot, people who are just squeaking by and could really use help. How do we help them? Well, what the mayor says is we should hold a lottery. We're going to build 500 to 1,000 affordable units in the next few years, and 1,000 lucky people out of maybe 10 or 100,000 people who are eligible are going to get $1 million prizes. Everybody else gets nothing. Now, if you had $100 million to give away to 10,000 or 100,000 people who are struggling with affordability, would you ever have a lottery where 10 people win or 100 people win and 90 or 95% of the people eligible get nothing? You'd never do that. Well, these lotteries are even worse, because the winner of the $1 million prize, which is $1 million apartment at lottery, for which they only have to pay $200,000, so maybe it's an $800,000 prize, okay? The prize winner, if you gave them $800,000, wouldn't buy a $1 million apartment. They'd probably go to New West and buy an apartment next to SkyTrain that would cost half as much, or maybe even a third as much. So you could build double or triple the amount of affordable housing if you took the best land in British Columbia, sold it to the market at top dollar, make an $800,000 property, turn around and build 2 or 3 affordable units out in New West next to the SkyTrain. That would be much more efficient. Even more efficient, sell for top dollar, take the money, and kick into the BC Housing Affordability Fund. Just give more money to people who we think are eligible for participating in these lotteries for $1 million apartments. I don't know why people think that's a good way to create affordable housing. It really isn't. Even worse idea that's been floated is housing subsidies. Hey, housing's too affordable, so let's encourage people to buy. If you rent a house, you get nothing. But if you buy a house, we're going to reduce the property transfer tax. What would that do? Well, let's take our existing willingness to pay for a house under the current tax system, and let's either give you a subsidy or cut the existing taxes when you buy a property. Well, my willingness to pay would be my pre-subsidy willingness to pay plus the subsidy. If I don't get the house, I don't get the subsidy, so I better bid up by the amount of the subsidy. What does that do? With a fixed supply of housing, okay, all of the subsidy goes to the people who sell the house. Dollar for dollar pass-through. Now, realistically, construction adapts a little bit to the price of housing, so you'd get a little bit new supply and not full pass-through, so there'd be some benefit to consumers. But pretty much, if everybody who bought a house got a subsidy, all you would do, as long as we're not dealing with the supply side, is pass all the benefit through to sellers. And it's even worse, because this subsidy has to be paid for, because the government has to balance its books. How do you pay for a subsidy? Higher taxes. So if I'm a renter struggling in a maybe rent-controlled unit and with no prayer of buying at the current price of $1,000 a square foot, I have to pay for a subsidy, mostly given to people who can easily afford housing. So people who can easily afford housing get a subsidy, renters get nothing, homeowners get a higher sale price, and renters get stuck with increased taxes. So the people who need the most help with affordability get a higher tax bill and no break at all because they're not eligible for the subsidy, but they have to pay for it. Housing subsidy for everybody, terrible idea. Targeted subsidies only for first-time buyers, most of the analysis is the same. There's still a lot of pass-through. You're still only giving a benefit to people who can afford to buy a house, nothing for renters, not much help to the people who are buying houses because so much is passed through to the sale price. So really not a great idea, and it's terrible for renters. So I worked at the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors advising the White House on what to do when we had a housing crisis in the U.S. where, believe it or not, the problem was housing prices were too low. There wasn't enough demand. When there's not enough demand, when prices are too low, a first-time buyer subsidy is a great idea. In Vancouver, where we've got a very, very hot market, it's bringing fuel to a fire. It's not good policy. Okay, how do I conclude? We certainly ought to add density in Vancouver, and Vision Vancouver needs to have the guts to do it. However, for the province, they don't control municipal policy, so cutting impact fees is not the way to go. The right way to go is the BC Housing Affordability Fund. Either the province, on behalf of high-cost jurisdictions or the jurisdictions themselves, can create a fund that writes checks to people who live and work in the Lower Mainland. It would discourage investors who use their homes as empty or barely used pied-à-terres, and it would encourage them instead to add to the housing supply, which would make living here more affordable for more people. Fee cuts, not a great idea because of incentives, and it's largely just increasing profitability to developers and people who sell land. Targeted subsidies and housing lotteries do a little bit, but it's a very inefficient use of resources. So that's my discussion of BC housing affordability issues. I look forward to your feedback. Thank you.